Welcome back. Right now, B2B performance marketers have got so much stacked against them when it comes to conversion tracking. You've got Firefox and Safari browsers automatically blocking or expiring tracking cookies. Consent mode is potentially costing you up to 80% of your measurable conversions. Chrome keeps on threatening to go cookieless. And in autumn 2026, Safari is threatening to block scripts from seeing URL queries, meaning click IDs from Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, and HubSpot could all vanish as soon as the page loads. Each one of these in isolation dramatically reduces the number of conversions you can measure, and when you add them all together, it's a massive curveball. And if you can't reliably track your conversions, it makes it much harder to optimize your ads and also to justify budget decisions. Today, I'm really excited to welcome Abbie Poots, CEO of Perazam Consulting. Abbie gave a fantastic talk on server-side tracking at HeroConf in Brighton earlier this year, and I'm really looking forward to getting her perspective on how to protect and future-proof conversion tracking. This is the B2B Performance Marketing Podcast by Webmarketer, here to help you make the right moves with your B2B advertising. No spin, no smoke and mirrors, just honest insights from the advertising frontline. Abbie, did you want to give yourself a little introduction and tell us what you do at Perazam?
The pros and cons. The pros is you don't need developers. Like, you can learn Google Tag Manager, you can set up basic conversions. So it's been good for marketers to be able. I find also a lot of UX designers would maybe want to set up some events that they want to capture. So those are the benefits, that you can easily set events up. The cons, let's say, or the limitations are, there are always going to be limitations. For example, if the person clicking around the website, if they click very fast, then maybe that page didn't have time to load. So that script didn't have time to load. So some of that tracking is gone. Also, it's just not the most robust tracking, like based on a click or something, or it might double fire or it might miss it. So there's lots of things like that. And additionally, now, more and more people are using ad blockers, right?
Yeah.
And so that impacts it. That means actually maybe like 30% is not being tracked anymore in analytics. And then now you've also got the cookie consent. So, if people are declining tracking cookies or, not selecting anything, then, part of your data is going to be lost. So those are the kind of limitations of client-side tracking. So then you have server-side tracking. So for example, with the Facebook Conversions API, the reason they did that was because it used to be that a Facebook cookie could follow you onto the website. So from Facebook to the website where you might purchase something. And then that cookie could also go back to Facebook and say, this person purchased something. But the change was that the cookie can no longer go back and say it, right? So what you can do, you can set up the event in like client-side Google Tag Manager, and you can capture that event on your website and you can send that to Facebook. The Conversions API, what they ask you to do is for you to send all of your server-side events to Facebook. So literally every single one, not where they came from, doesn't matter. Just send all of them with all the parameters that your server can capture. And so the server is more robust because, for example, a purchase that happens, it's only going to happen once, because that is just one purchase that happened on the server, whereas it might, have loaded twice on a client-side tracking. And it's not subject to the cookie compliance laws. I mean, it is a little bit, but less so. So Facebook asks then people to send all of those server side back to Facebook. And then what Facebook does is they deduplicate the events, and they use an algorithm to say, okay, we think that, these people purchased. So that essentially is the difference between server side tracking and client side tracking. So the server side, it might have additional parameters. It will also, by the way, it will still capture some things from the browser. So for example, like the Facebook cookie, that needs to be captured from the browser. Like, it's not created on the server. So it does still need to capture some information from the browser and send it on. And then I'd like to just make a distinction between server-side tracking, which is directly from like literally your back-end server. So if you were doing one type of conversions API you could do is like from your back end code, you're sending it to the API. But there's also server side tagging, which is slightly different. So you can have a client side tracking and a client side Google Tag Manager. Server side tagging is when you place the tags on like your own server or on a hosted server. So you forward all of the client side events to a server container. There are some benefits to that. I can give you a few. Number one, you may be able to bypass some ad blockers because you can load that server side container from your own domain.
Mm-hmm.
And how ad blockers work is like they're recognizing, oh, this is Google Analytics. We're not going to load that script. But if you load it from your own domain, then that is bypassed. So that's one of the benefits. You can do it in such a way that you're generating first-party cookies. Mm-hmm. And so you can have a longer cookie lifetime value. So that would probably make the returning users more accurate because that cookie has been extended so it can identify that person as having been a visitor before. Another benefit is you can enrich the data. So you can send data from your actual backend server. That could be like product data. It could be profit margins. It could be customer data. You can send that to the container, and then the container can get all this data amalgamated before sending, for example, to Google Analytics or to an ad platform. So yeah, there's a bit of a distinction between server-side tracking and server-side tagging. I'm sure everyone's at least heard the buzzwords of server-side. Just a note on that, I would like to say that I think a lot of people are like, oh yeah, server-side, yeah, that'll just fix everything. And that's not the case.
Yeah.
It can improve things, but it's not like there is no, unfortunately, sorry to spoil it, there's no 100% solution to this tracking dilemma.
Yeah, that was something I was keen to speak to you about in today's episode, actually, is how much of these curveballs that are coming down the road like can be fixed by server side and kind of to what extent. But I'm sure we'll get into that in a minute. So just to kind of, I guess from my part, demonstrate understanding or maybe throw my interpretation out and see if it's right or wrong. So almost like client side is anything on the front end, right? Is anything when you're visiting a website, if it's happening with front end engagement, so engagement with the page, that's client side. Server side tracking is when information, for example, passes through a form, it's taken in that process from server side and passed back. And then server side tagging is more like saving something in a database on a server, for example, like your website domain or your website hosting. Is that about right? Or does that need some tweaking?
Yeah, so the server-side tagging, I would just say you're not storing any information. It's just that the tags, like the marketing tags, are hosted on a container which is server-side, but it can receive information from your database and be enriched before it's sent anywhere. And yeah, for the server-side, there's no specific rules about what things it is or isn't, right, because it really just depends. Because, for example, I actually know some developers that have set up their back end, like they've got all this database and for example, they've decided they want to measure the engagement time, and it's possible, but of course that would be a lot of data, and most people wouldn't want to put that all on their server. Generally speaking, it's like the more robust events, like a purchase or maybe a lead form submission. If something has to happen on like the back end database, then it's server side. So page views, for example, often wouldn't happen server side, especially now when you've got the like single page applications that are very popular.
That makes total sense. So it's kind of like almost like the handshake between the front end, the client side, and the back end, like physical database. Yeah. Makes total sense.
Yeah.
So I kind of talked about it before and said we'd get into it. You know, as conscientious marketers, it feels like we're dealing with more and more curveballs over time. And sometimes it feels like maybe the curveballs as kind of small and medium-sized businesses are much bigger than it might be for an enterprise level business where it might be more like a road bump. So kind of going back to what I was saying before, like how much of these kind of tracking gaps can be fixed by kind of server-side tracking, or to what extent can you fill in those missing bits?
Yeah, there's a few things that I would always recommend. And there's also a few things that, maybe keep coming up for me. One thing is making sure that consent mode V2 is correctly implemented. And I'm kind of smiling here because I think part of the reason I get business is because it could be that the marketers are like, there's something not quite right here. We don't think it's correctly implemented. But then you can have the developers who are like, oh, we followed it, yeah, we did it. What exactly is wrong? But because the marketer maybe doesn't have the technical expertise or knowledge, they cannot really give something specific as to why they think it isn't set up correctly, which of course for a stereotypical developer, they're maybe more very rational, very factual based, very like, okay, well, what is the problem? How have you identified something as being wrong? And what I find is that developers might be, I don't want to be too harsh. I think it's just, you can follow documentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're good at that. But I would say that maybe not all the documentation from these consent management platforms actually covers everything. So it's like you could follow documentation, but of course, everything's slightly different based on your website, based on what tags you're using. So unless you actually have the knowledge of what are you allowed to do and what are you not allowed to do? So I have a checklist that I'll go through that can apply to any consent management platform. There's certain things that need to happen. So for example, a default consent state needs to be set. So that's the default before anyone does anything. Then, if someone selects yes or no or specific cookies, then you need to make sure that is sent to Google Tag Manager or wherever to make sure that the right tags fire or don't fire. Then you also need to make sure that people can change their preferences and that is updated. What I've seen often is maybe an incorrect implementation of consent mode. To give you one example, some developers just thought, oh, we're just going to block all tracking scripts unless they accept all cookies, things like that, where it's like, no, you actually are, there are certain tags that are allowed to fire. So yeah, so that's one thing that I'm just seeing quite often, is making sure that is correctly set up. And yeah, I think it's challenging because I think, to be honest, it is a little bit technical. I've tried to show some marketers and then it actually is a bit too technical. Yeah. In terms of I would say advice on what can be done, to be totally honest, I think that my general advice for marketers and businesses is, what data do you want to collect? Do you actually know that? Because I've also seen frustration in between maybe developers who have to set up the events and Google Analytics, and then the marketing team, they're not being specific enough. They don't fully know what they want. I also often come across they don't realize that you cannot backtrack. You can't backfill your data.
Yeah.
And I've had that quite surprisingly often. I've had that where they're like, oh, but can we not capture retrospectively? And I'm like, no, it needs to be set up first. Having a thorough tracking plan, which starts with what data do you want to collect and why do you want to collect it? And that's the baseline. And then from that, you can say, how can we collect this data? And then you can develop each strand of how can we collect this data in the most robust and accurate way possible? And then, what are you going to do with this data? What does it mean? How do you analyze it? So, there's some things where I'd say, okay, have consent mode, have server-side tracking where possible, or server-side tagging. Just make sure, I see a lot of kind of little mistakes in how the Google Ads conversions are set up, or Bing ads, or Facebook ads. So it's having that bit of a tracking audit. Is everything measuring what you think you're measuring? And also, I often see a lot of analytics that just haven't, I don't know, I think unless there's a person that is responsible for Google Analytics, I feel like no one wants to take responsibility for it. I can understand that it's frustrating because even Google Analytics offers some events to be captured by default under the enhanced measurement. And I often see a lot of people just have them by default turned on and they didn't even know about it. Or they go to the events section and some are marked as key events and they don't even know what it is. Or there's also events that have just appeared there that no one knows about, that actually were created by Google whenever they converted the Universal Analytics account to a GA4 account. So it's capturing stuff. No one set it up, but no one's checked. And then people go in and read the data, and then surprisingly often I have it where people aren't sure of the data, like they
Yep.
don't know what it's
Yep.
tracking. So yeah, sorry, because I feel like it sounds a bit basic, but like I've been surprised at how many companies just don't have a good handle on that. And yeah, and maybe it is a responsibility thing, like a delegation thing. It's who takes responsibility for this.
We see exactly the same thing. Like it's a case where most businesses want the data, and they want the data that's going to be useful at the time it needs to be useful. But I guess the challenging thing with data is that if you haven't already considered exactly what you need to track and how that needs to be set up, to your point exactly, well, until you actually set that up, well, potentially it's going to be 12 months plus, or even 3 years plus before that starts to become insightful, right? You don't get year-on-year data until after 12 months, and you don't really get any kind of meaningful trends until kind of 3 years plus. And it's, yeah, I can't, like I said, I can't agree enough. Our take on it is you've got the business plan, which informs the marketing plan. The marketing plan says how it's going to fill the gaps like outlined by the business plan, but there's also almost a tracking plan that kind of takes that marketing plan and goes, okay, well, this is everything that marketing needs to do, and this is the strategy and the tactics, and this is what we need to achieve. And the tracking plan almost then creates a feedback loop on how that's working. And if someone hasn't taken the initiative or the responsibility to really take that and look at the ads tracking and the Google Analytics tracking and kind of think both strategically and tactically about it, well, you don't end up with good data to prove and to iterate on.
Yeah. And I think it can be really challenging when your business is already running, and like for the larger businesses that have many channels, although often they're maybe able to collect a lot more data and try to identify things. But one thing I would say for kind of small, medium enterprises is I would try to like launch one channel at a time.
Yeah.
Or do you know, so that you can say, so because for example, I'm working with a client and I've recommended, and then their investor also recommended this, so that was good. But just like one channel at a time, because we're getting leads, and they get leads anyway through the website. They have a good organic presence as well, and they know that those are like quality leads. And then we've got Facebook campaign, and we want to know the quality of those Facebook leads. But there was no consent mode set up. Most of the Facebook traffic is put through analytics as direct. And then they were not capturing any UTM parameters, from the browser into the server, into their CRM. And so they didn't have that there. And then it's very much well, I think, and that's not, I mean, and I'm not saying, to be honest, sometimes I think your gut feel like can be correct. And especially if you're very in the business and you know everything, you can get a feel for it. But it's so important, especially if, I think there needs to be like unity as well in the company or in the marketing team. But like, you can have the team for Facebook and the team for Google Ads and the team for LinkedIn or whatever, who are all trying to argue that their leads are the best or whatever, or they have the most impact. And so it's about kind of trying to work together and like, what's the smartest way to do this? Wow, I'm just so thankful I don't ever have to deal with any company politics again. I was just imagining. Yeah, because it's true. If you're, what if they find out like Facebook's not a good channel, and then if you do Facebook ads, then whereas for me, like, it doesn't matter. I'm like, well, yeah, that's okay. Then don't do Facebook, and we won't do it. It's okay.
Yeah. It must be nice to kind of have that. We were talking before the call, weren't we, around kind of that ability to have a deliverable as, a tracking consultant, but also kind of that knowledge that, when you're done with your work, you're making the visibility of performance better. And can you talk a little bit, because, in episode 2 of this podcast, we talked about consent mode and how to set that up correctly, which you've gone a little bit deeper into there, which is great. And then we've also talked about deduping reports and how to do attribution and how that can conflict against each other. But I think what would be really useful is, we talked in our consent mode episode around how you could potentially lose up to 80% of your data, which we've seen in the worst case, by not having it set up correctly. But what we're talking about here is almost like the positive side of that, right? Is like by maybe putting consent mode to one side, but by focusing on, server side tracking, What are your thoughts towards like what kind of uplift you could see and how much more data you can track, like how much that improves your visibility? Because that's really what's been impacted here, right? We're in this world where privacy, like user-centric privacy, is really important, but it is also at the expense of the visibility of data, right?
Yeah, I think on average, it's hard to say, but I would say a 20% uplift potentially in the number of sessions that is being
Yeah.
recorded. And also the percentage of unassigned traffic often then like goes down in the server side GA4, for example, that I see. So yeah, I definitely it's a good idea in the beginning that I'll still run a client side GA4 and I'll also run a server side GA4 so I can actually see the difference. Because then, yeah, I prefer that as well, because then I can literally show the client and be like, okay, well, this is, what happens with client and this is what happens with server. Because the truth is, like, every website's different, every audience is different. So you don't really know. I think that's one of the challenging things is it's really hard to give the average percentage because, like, it can be so different. So yeah, I'd recommend recording a before and after. So still having a client side GA4 and a server side GA4.
Yeah, that's really smart. And it makes total sense. Yeah. So I guess like another question that I'd have then is, obviously if you're kind of a business looking to get started with server side tracking, I appreciate it can be quite a daunting task, right? It's difficult to know kind of how it works. And I appreciate you taking us through that today, but also it's quite difficult to know where to get started as well. Like it'd be really great to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ways to do it, not that many. You can use Stape.io is a very popular one because they make it quite affordable and I'd say they're quite helpful with the implementation if you need it. And I do feel like they are putting their efforts into keeping abreast of all the latest developments and then trying to come up with some kind of solution if possible. Yeah, and otherwise you can host it just on Google Cloud or wherever you can set up a server-side container. But yeah, it really depends if you have a back-end team, because I know some companies where they actually source their website development. So then it's a bit harder and sometimes, those developers are helpful, but then they're maybe not knowledgeable. And then sorry, I hate blowing my own trumpet, but I would just say, yeah, I'm the type of person that helps with that. I don't really know where else you can really find out about it. I mean, yeah, you can find out about it online, but often then they are technical guides of how to implement it, which is fine. If you're technical and you can handle all that, then yeah, go for it. There's some, Simo Ahava is a great one. He has a really great blog with a lot of instructions, and there's a few blogs out there that can, show you how to do it. But honestly, I think there's so many changes and there's so many kind of niche things. For example, Microsoft, they just updated their rules like in the beginning of May, I think it was. So you need to make sure that the consent mode really is properly set up or Bing ads will not receive any pings. If you're setting up, like every ad platform is slightly different as well. And then it's dependent on the data layer that's available. Like for example, to format the data to be sent into Facebook, that's different to how you format the data for GA4. And there's so many little things that, I mean, I guess this is why I've been able to like develop a business in this area because like sometimes people think it's simple. And then I've had people that have hired me as a consultant, or they're just like, do you know what, I can do this. Like, can you show me how to do this? And I'm like, sure, I don't mind. I'm like, yeah, no problem. And then like by the end of the call, they're like, so thanks for showing me everything, but I think I might actually just pay you to do it. That's happened to me quite a few times. And I'm genuinely trying to keep it as simple as possible, but there are a lot of steps. And the thing is, maybe for like smaller companies, like one mistake might not have such a big impact. Although it also might. But with larger companies, like if you have one small error, that does have a big impact because of the large volume of data that you're processing. And yeah, especially with things like consent mode, there could be like a small setting that isn't set up correctly, or your tags could be firing before the consent default is set. Like, for example, I've seen the reason a lot of people have unassigned traffic is because the session start is being triggered after the first page view. Right. or the page views being triggered before like the consent. So like actually the first page view, the consent was not granted. It's not marked as granted, but then the following ones are. So then you have all of this unassigned traffic. So there's things like that to kind of watch out for. Yeah.
That's a really good point. And I guess if you see unassigned traffic in your Google Analytics, that's kind of what that's saying. But I also appreciate your honesty there. You know, Stape being a good place to start software wise. But I think part of what you said there as well is kind of earlier on in our discussion was a lot of the time, a big part of the problem is that almost marketers speak a different language to developers. So if you kind of want to get started off your own back, well, if you're a marketer, you need to kind of learn how to speak the developer too, right?
And sometimes that is never going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what I would say is I typically find, especially with some of the maybe marketing agencies that I work with, they maybe have a couple of really good technical people, like they're marketers, but they're very technical. They're very like proactive in learning, but they are kind of like little gems. And I think in general, and I also kind of understand, like, if you go into marketing, or a lot of people who've gone into marketing, they've gone in for the psychology, the brand marketing. They've not gone in to set up technical stuff. So I get it as well. And that's why I think there is kind of like a little growing niche. Like I do know other people who do the same work that I do, but it's not a huge community. But that's why I think there is a bit of a niche for this kind of work.
Absolutely, yeah. And I know you kind of maybe played down that potential. I know we're talking averages that kind of fluctuate a lot here, right? But a 20% uplift in visibility for a very small business, that's not going to be noticeable. But as soon as you start getting up into the medium-sized businesses, that could be a huge impact. That could be kind of transformational in terms of that feedback that you can use to optimize, right? So yeah. And another thing that I kind of wanted to pull back from our kind of conversation before we pressed the recording button, you were talking a little bit about how tech stack can actually influence what you can measure as well, right?
Yeah, like sometimes I wish I'd got there earlier, or they'd reached out earlier, because they've decided on using this form and this platform and embedding this and doing that. And then they want you to track all of it. And sometimes I end up saying to them, I'm like, look, I could do a custom solution, and if you're willing to pay me, I'm explaining the solution. This is how much time it will take, and this is, everything that would need to be done. Or, I shouldn't talk myself out of business, but it would be like, I don't ever like to recommend something that doesn't make sense. Or I'm saying to them, maybe you should build this form yourself, or, that probably would be the cheaper option or the more effective option. So yeah, because even things like cross-domain tracking, there's no guarantee that cross-domain tracking, even if you've set it up, will actually work. One of the reasons for that, I've had this before, where the website to make the actual booking was on a third party, but that third party domain is like everyone, uses this third party domain, and it has its own consent state.
Right. Yeah.
So I could accept cookies on the first site, but then when I go to the third party, it's set to denied again. And, I spoke to the third party and they were like, oh, we could just set it all to granted. And I'm like, I mean, you could, but that's not really compliant. There are some consent management platforms where you can configure the same consent to apply to multiple domains. So you can say that this cookie banner is across these two domains, so that like if they switch between them, it will retain that consent. So sometimes that could work, but that's just an example of where, and it's also about like when the tags fire and everything. And because now, even to do my job, I used to often be able to just kind of use Google Tag Manager and other tools, but now I really need to use the developer tools in the browser and look at the network tab, because that's the only place that actually like tells you for real like what is actually being sent. Because like Google Tag Manager might tell you which tags are being fired, but it won't tell you if the information's actually being sent or rejected or blocked.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think that's something that we've encountered a number of times as well. Like we're trying to set up ads tracking the same, like if the consent isn't there, then obviously there's work to be done there. But it's also one of those things that I think it's really easy to overlook as marketers, where it's like, okay, well, I want to build a quote calculator. So I'm going to bring in something like Outgrow. Oh, I'm going to make it easier to schedule calls. So I'm going to bring in something like Calendly. I want to turn out conversion pages much faster. So I'm going to bring in something like Unbounce or Lead Pages. And all of a sudden, you've got that online journey that's spanning between multiple different types of software, all with their different tracking restrictions, right? And then now you're left with only a small part of the journey that you can actually see and measure.
Yeah, it's so important because, often if you go across, then you're losing the original source medium, the original referrer. There's not really a way of getting that back. Sometimes you can build something that might like capture it in local storage and then be able to pick it up. But even then, it's this kind of convoluted way of doing things that also often doesn't have a 100% guarantee of working. And it's tough sometimes because I've worked with a client where they had a Calendly page and then I was recommending to embed the Calendly widget so that I could track it in Google Ads and track it all as one session. And then we did do that, but then she just noticed that, she wasn't getting as many bookings. And she was like, look, I just want to put it on this page because that seems to work better. And it does for whatever reason. She's getting more bookings by doing it that way. But then it means I can't track in Google Ads the full thing or in Google Analytics. We have a list of all the times and dates of when the Calendly bookings were made. And then I have all like the clicks from Google Ads at what time they came from. But because Google Ads couldn't track the conversion, you're basically trying to figure out, we were trying to figure out between two campaigns, like they were both quite similar, but the lead quality had gone down a bit and we were trying to figure out, does this campaign have better quality leads than the other? And so we're literally trying to marry these pieces of data together to figure it out. Ultimately, I mean, this client's actually very good. She's very on it and she knows her business. She knows when it's doing well. They track everything. They track the call quality. And so it's good. And so she kind of like has a feel for it. And then we kind of have this missing part that we're trying to figure out, because in her case, I would say that is the right business decision. Like if you saw that like you're getting bookings with that and you took it away, then absolutely do that. And then we're just trying to figure out, is there any way we could send some information back into Google Ads to say these people converted?
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's almost like, if you make the right commercial decision, ideally the right commercial decision can go hand in hand with being able to track it properly. But if it doesn't, then you've kind of got to figure out a backup plan, right?
That is one thing I would say, because obviously I specialize in tracking and I'm going to recommend, whatever. But ultimately, my background is in performance marketing. I am a business person. So I do get it. I'd say whatever is the right decision. Don't be too hung up on having perfect tracking or whatever it is. Because what's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is that, your business can continue making money or whatever, right? The goal is not to have perfect tracking if your business is then going to go under. It's a bit of a balance. Trying to kind of achieve both.
Yeah, I totally get it. Almost like a matrix between, performing the best and not being able to track anything, and then perfect tracking and not being able to generate any performance, right? You gotta make some compromises and it's never going to be perfect. So maybe a bit of a lazy question. Are there any questions that I haven't asked you that I maybe should have?
I think we didn't really touch that much on the first party data. So most clients, actually that same client who is really on it, like she does ask, she knows that Google Ads is working. Because she asks people, even if the data doesn't reflect it, because to be honest, the data in some of our Google Ads campaigns doesn't look that good, but we know that when it wasn't running, it wasn't good. And she knows that people are coming from Google Ads, even if we can't track it. Definitely think about what are all the ways that you can track data. Like we shouldn't be reliant on only Google Analytics. We shouldn't be fully reliant on any platform. And I think it's good to have a combination of, you can have your analytics, you can have your back-end data. I recommend tools like Microsoft Clarity, because if you really kind of want to get in and you can segment the traffic by source and see what's happening. And then also asking your customers, how did they hear about you? And trying to capture, just think of like, what are all the possible data points that you could capture? And at least, even if you don't know what you're going to do with it right now, try to spend, I know everyone's always like really busy and things, get deprioritized, but just try to take the time to think of what are all the data points that you could measure and set them up so that think ahead, think in 6 months, what would we want to be looking back on? Is it the number of users? Is it the number of users who've been on a certain number of seconds? Or are there certain events on the website that you want to capture? Is there a certain question you want to ask people after they submit a form? I would say the businesses I see that are doing well, or the best that I know, are the ones they usually know. They know there is no perfect tracking solution. They're well aware of that, and they don't complain about the tracking. They're just like, right, have we got all this? Is this all as optimal as it can be? Great. But then they also are keeping a close eye on things. So they're reviewing their Google and Meta, and they're thinking about the whole journey and the whole business. And maybe another thing is incrementality testing.
Sure.
Which could be good, especially for those larger businesses that have many channels and they can't really turn a channel off for a month to test it or whatever. But maybe, for example, turning off a specific location in one of the campaigns and then seeing what is the drop of leads in that particular location, and then trying to measure what the difference is, and then model that to be like, okay, well, what would it be like? How many conversions do we think we're really getting from Facebook ads?
Yeah, that's such a good point, isn't it? It's almost like, well, don't turn everything off, but if you can test a sample size by turning a little bit off and seeing what the impact is, that makes loads of sense. So
yeah.
Abbie, thanks so much for coming on. You've brought such a wealth of knowledge and experience here, and I'm sure people are going to get a load of value from everything you've talked about. I guess to end on, it'd be really good to hear, if people want to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
They can contact me on LinkedIn, drop me a message, or you can email helpme@perazam.com. So send me if you have any questions, or want some advice, or want a tracking audit or something, then feel free to get in touch.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
I really hope you found today's episode useful. Abbie shared so many dynamite insights, and I really hope it goes a long way to helping you plug some of those conversion gaps. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that this is a huge and complex area, and getting a 20% uplift in the number of conversions that you can see could be an absolute game changer. So rather than learning a completely new language and a different way of doing things, it's much better to speak to a specialist in the area and get the aces in their places. As always, if you found this episode useful, please leave us a review. We're on a mission to remove the smoke and mirrors from the B2B advertising world, and every review helps us spread the word. And if you've got a burning question or a topic that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, please let us know. Just head to webmarketeruk.com/topic and fill in the form. We really want to make each episode as useful as possible, and we read every single message. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode.